All right, hello, welcome everybody. Thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Kate Schwanhauser and I am the Special Events Manager here at Food and Water Watch. And we are hosting today's event in response to the recent Supreme Court ruling in the West Virginia versus the Environmental Protection Agency case. I'm sure a lot of you have been following news stories about this ruling, and a lot of them are pretty doom and gloom, and we're not going to lie to you, it's a terrible decision with some bad implications, but it's also not the end of the road. And that's what's really important to remember. And that's why we wanted to gather here with all of you today. Food and Water Watch has been working on these issues for years, and we have always had a multi-pronged approach to fighting climate change head on. Our supporters, like all of you here today, have always been right there alongside us. And so this may be a setback in one area, but there are still many other fronts that we have been and will continue to keep fighting on, including ramping up pressure on President Biden, on Congress, at the state and local government level, and more. So before we get into that conversation, I just have a few quick Zoom reminders for today. So first, the chat box is open. So please feel free to use that to introduce yourself, share where you're joining from today. And it's also where we will be sharing some links during the event today. So keep an eye out there for those resources. If you need to turn on closed captioning to add subtitles to your screen, you can click on the live transcript button that you see in your Zoom toolbar to enable that feature. And finally, I am recording today's event, so I will be sharing that link later with everyone who RSVP'd, along with some of the resources that we'll be sharing in the chat today. All right, so let's go ahead and get to it. Today, we're going to hear from a few of my colleagues about what this ruling means and the ways that we can continue to take action. So first, I'd like to welcome Tara Heinzen. She is our legal director and has been working to incorporate litigation and creative legal strategies into Food and Water Watch's campaigns for over 6 years. So thanks so much for being here today, Tara. I will turn it over to you for an introduction.
Great, thanks, Kate. Thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm just going to give a brief overview of the West Virginia decision and kind of tee up the discussion of what it means for our work and how we're going to keep fighting. I'll try to keep it pretty high level. So this case was an industry challenge to the Obama era Clean Power Plan, which would have established the first greenhouse gas regulations for existing power plants. This rule never was able to go into effect, but the court took up the challenge nonetheless. This Clean Power Plan relied on EPA's Clean Air Act authority under a section called Section 111D. And that part of the Clean Air Act says that EPA has to adopt a standard that is called the best system of emissions reduction for existing pollution sources. So EPA has to decide what is this best system for existing power plants. EPA decided that it should adopt a system that would set emissions caps. And it also implemented a lot of ways to provide states with flexibility to develop their own plans for how to meet these emissions caps, including, importantly, generation shifting strategies to move away from fossil fuels and towards cleaner fuels. So this system was broader than just a technology standard requiring each plant to reduce its own greenhouse gas emissions a certain amount. Now, what the court did is it held that EPA lacks authority under Section 111D of the Clean Air Act to adopt rules that would require this generation shifting away from fossil fuels and towards less polluting forms of energy, ideally renewable energy. So the decision was in that way specific to the court's interpretation of the language of Section 111D of the Clean Air Act, that best system of emissions reduction language. The court said that Congress didn't clearly enough say that a system of emissions reduction could include generation shifting, and therefore EPA had exceeded its authority under the Clean Air Act. So the good news is that the decision doesn't mean EPA cannot regulate fossil fuel energy plant emissions at all, but it does significantly limit EPA's ability to come up with creative and industry-wide approaches to power plant emissions. The bad news, which I'll try not to dwell on too much, but it's important, is the court's reasoning. It's how it got to its conclusion that EPA had overstepped. The court relied on something called the Major Questions Doctrine to justify striking down the rule. This doctrine is a conservative legal idea that says federal agencies need explicit authorization from Congress to decide issues of major economic and political significance. So basically here the court said that because a shift in our energy sector away from coal and gas towards renewables has major economic and policy significance, it is a major question and the agency can't act without express congressional approval. It's kind of hard to overstate how big a departure this is from how courts have taken up these questions for decades. It departs from decades of precedent saying that agencies should have deference to act when a statute doesn't say exactly what it should do about an issue. And so in effect, the court here is really, it's a power grab by the court away from the executive branch and also away from Congress, which intended for EPA to be able to address issues related to air pollution. And if this major questions doctrine concept sounds kind of made up, that's because it is. The court created this doctrine itself. And this case was the first time a majority of the Supreme Court based a decision on the major questions doctrine. The concerning thing is that we know it won't be the last. So the upshot here is that this decision is a major attack on federal regulatory authority, and we're likely to see the court raise it time and time again to strike down rules that it decides are major. There are no parameters around this doctrine. There's nothing that the court is bound by in deciding what it thinks is major. So it really, again, is a huge power grab by the court. And in fact, we know that industry groups are already seeing this as a huge new tool in their arsenal. They are teeing up major questions arguments already to challenge proposed rules, for example, on tailpipe greenhouse gas emissions, and also an SEC rule to require companies to disclose their greenhouse gas impacts. So we're gonna have to be really smart about anticipating these arguments in our own advocacy and prepare to fight them in court. And EPA and other agencies also know that this is coming. It's a new front that they're going to have to engage on. And hopefully they'll think really carefully about how to write their rules to head off these major questions arguments as much as possible. But the flip side is we need to make sure that they don't water down their rules or that they aren't so chilled by fear of legal action that they won't take the bold actions that we know are necessary. So with that, I think I'm going to turn it back to Kate.
Thanks, Tara. That was a really great overview. I appreciate you sharing that with us and what it means for EPA's ability to regulate going forward. I would like to ask my colleagues Mitch and Alex to join us as we turn to the next part of this conversation, which is, really the question of, so what now? So what can we keep doing to address the climate crisis with the urgency that it deserves? Mitch is our Managing Director of Advocacy Programs and Policy, and Alex is our Northeast Region Director. So we're going to dive a little bit more into what we can all do to keep taking action. So I think let's start at the federal level. So Mitch, I'll ask my first question for you. Can you just tell us a little bit more about what Congress can still do?
Yeah, definitely, Kate. Thank you, and thanks for that great overview, Tara. That was really succinct and illuminating about what the ruling actually does, but also about what it doesn't do. And that's, I think, what we kind of want to focus on now. As Tara said, there's a bit of a power grab from the Supreme Court, both to the administration and to Congress, but that doesn't mean Congress can't still act. In fact, Congress has within its authority all of its power to act. And it's important as we look at fighting climate change on a national level and even on a global level, we know that we're going to have congressional action. So we don't want to stop focusing a good portion of our work on the federal level, on Congress. There's a great bill that was introduced in the last Congress and earlier in this Congress by Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky and Congresswoman Nanette Berrigan, called the Future Generations Protection Act, that would ban fracking, stop new fossil fuel power plants, and would stop the exports of crude oil and liquefied natural gas and natural gas liquids. That bill is key to building a real future, fighting climate change, confronting the fossil fuel industry. We still need to work to build support for that legislation within Congress, within the Democratic caucus. We have, in the more immediate moment right now, the House of Representatives is literally within this week and next week debating and passing appropriations bills that will fund the government for the next year. We need to fight to make sure that we cut subsidies for fossil fuels in that legislation going forward so that we don't continue to send our taxpayer dollars into the pockets of the oil and gas industry and their Wall Street bankers. We know Congress has to act, but that also means that we know we have to continue to organize within the key districts in Congress to get legislation in the future. We're not naive. We recognize the constraints of the current balance in Congress, but we also know we have to build climate champions within Congress so that when the balance of power shifts again in our favor, we're able to take advantage of that. And I think that, we at Food and Water Watch are kind of uniquely placed to help with that, because not only do we have a really great legal team led by Tara, but we also have, a great policy team working in Washington, working on Capitol Hill with offices. And we coupled those two with a robust and aggressive organizing team to work in districts, in states, to put pressure on members so that they know that when we're ready to get these votes brought to the floor, they have to vote the right way.
Thank you, Mitch. Yeah, and in addition to keeping up this pressure on Congress, we also need to put an equal or more amount of pressure on President Biden. I know that there's some authority and actions that he could take. So maybe could you share a little bit about what President Biden can do?
Sure. Again, yes, this does restrict sort of what the EPA can do. It's not a good decision. We don't want to sugarcoat it, but there are still things we can do. And I actually want to just mention, Food and Water Watch has a petition before the EPA under a different provision of the Clean Air Act to enforce action on greenhouse gases. So I just want to actually turn to Tara for a second again to talk a little bit about that petition, which is still alive, not affected by this ruling. So Tara, do you want to say a little bit about that?
Sure, yeah. In early 2019, Food and Water Watch led a legal petition to EPA, making the argument that EPA can, and in fact has an obligation to list greenhouse gases under Section 112 of the Clean Air Act, which regulates hazardous air pollutants. We know that EPA has made what's called an endangerment finding about greenhouse gases because they endanger public health and welfare. And the language in Section 112 related to hazardous air pollutants mirrors that endangerment language. And we argue that it gives EPA authority to use that separate program, which is also very powerful, to directly regulate greenhouse gas emissions from all kinds of industrial sources. As Mitch said, that petition is still pending. EPA has an obligation to respond to it within, I think, 180 days. They have missed that deadline. And so we have some options to push for an EPA answer to that petition. Other groups have also filed different greenhouse gas regulation petitions. So a lot of organizations have set out roadmaps for EPA explaining the many ways that it can and should use its authority under the Clean Air Act to start meaningfully regulating greenhouse gases from all sorts of industries. And I'll just follow that by saying briefly, as I kind of indicated before, the case isn't what I would call narrow, but it only does address one provision of the Clean Air Act. And EPA can still regulate even under that provision if it does it in a way that doesn't kind of reach beyond the fence line of the facility, which is what the court really took issue with here, is how EPA's system led to this requirement of generation shifting. So EPA still has authority to regulate power plant emissions. It has authority to regulate auto emissions. It can also regulate other air pollutants at regulated sources in ways that will obtain what are often referred to as co-benefits, because imposition of new technologies for other pollutants will also result sometimes in reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. So EPA does have options to move forward.
Thanks, Tara. So, not only does EPA have that authority, and frankly, they should grant our petition today. They should have granted it the day after the court ruling, and we're keeping pressure on them to do so. But the president himself still retains a lot of authority. We have called on the president to declare a climate emergency. We continue to call on the president to declare a climate emergency, which would free up new powers for him to directly confront the fossil fuel industry. The president has the authority to stop leasing and drilling on public lands, which he promised to do and which we are continuing to pressure him to do. He can stop new fossil fuel infrastructure like the Mountain Valley Pipeline, which unfortunately we've heard Just this week, Joe Manchin is demanding probably for his vote to support a reconciliation bill that the Mountain Valley Pipeline be approved. We at Food and Water Watch, along with allies and grassroots groups on the ground, have done a lot of work to stymie that project so far. And the president could end it now. He has the authority to do these things. This ruling didn't affect that. And then really most recently, the administration released a 5-year plan for leasing in the Gulf of Mexico. And unfortunately, that plan, which was released 13 days ago, that plan contains 11 new leases. There shouldn't be any new leases in that plan. We can ask him now, it's public comment period, to rewrite that plan and remove those leases. We've just put in the chat a link where you can send a comment into the Department of Interior to change that Gulf lease plan. So there are a lot of things that the president can do, the EPA can do, the Department of Interior can do, and Congress can do still even after this awful ruling by the Supreme Court.
Thanks, Mitch, and thanks, Tara. Yeah, there's a lot we can do. We just need to keep up the pressure and keep speaking up on these issues. And it's really exciting to see so many of you in the chat ready to take action through these links or make calls. And that's exactly what we need. So thank you all so much for being willing to jump right in. So I want to turn now to Alex and just ask you to tell us a little bit more about, what's going on at the state and local level. What progress have we made recently?
Sure, yeah, thanks. So I'm going to start, I'm going to say a little bit about 2 big victories that I worked a lot on, along with a bunch of our organizers in the Northeast. So let's start in Pennsylvania. So, as folks might be aware, Pennsylvania is often seen as this like pro-fracking state where there's nothing you can do on the issue. The reality on the ground is a lot different from that, right? So for those of you not super familiar with the political dynamics of the state, the Republicans have both houses of the legislature in Pennsylvania. The governor's Democratic, Tom Wolf, he's also really pro-fracking. He's been pro-fracking the entirety of his administration. His DEP has been incredibly lax in regulating the oil and gas industry, as you might imagine. So that's kind of the dynamics of the state we're working in. And so what we've done is focus a lot on building power locally, both to change those underlying political dynamics, but also to win real victories in the short term. So we've done that to pretty great effect, particularly in Western Pennsylvania. So in Allegheny County, we've done a lot of work zoning fracking out. So not only are the politics not great in Pennsylvania, local towns and cities, unlike in my home state of New York, can't just straight up say, we're not going to frack here. You can't just ban it at the local level. What you can do is change your zoning ordinance so that it's basically impossible to frack in your town, in your community, in your municipality. So we've done that. We've gone town by town by town in Allegheny County and changed the zoning laws by working with locals on the ground. And what we've found is that that is really labor-intensive work, and it is hard. It's not particularly complicated, right? No one actually wants a fracking well in their community. So we've done this in 23 different municipalities across Allegheny County so far. There are a bunch more that will win in the next year or so. So that like local organizing has really worked. And we've now seen it level up to the next level, for lack of a better word. So at the county level, we've just banned fracking in all county parks. This is really significant, right? Allegheny County is a really urban county. It is difficult to frack in urban places, but there's a lot of shale underneath it. So one really, really attractive place to frack is these big parks that the county owns. And indeed, they've already fracked some of them. So we just passed last week a county level ban. This is a big, big deal. It's the only county level action against the oil and gas industry that we know of in the state. And not only did we passed it with a huge majority. That's good news because the county executive also vetoed it last week. And we now think that we have the votes to override that veto at next week's meeting. So really big deal. And we think over time, this is what's going to turn the tide politically against fracking throughout the entire state. So that's some good news from Pennsylvania. In New York, we've also won a bunch of big victories over the years. And just this past couple months, Some key victories in this broader fight against cryptocurrency mining operations, repowering gas-fired power plants. That sounds like a complicated issue. Here's what I really mean. So, as you might know, there's this lucrative Bitcoin mining operation going on across the country. It is really, really, really energy intensive. And so what some companies are doing to mine cryptocurrency is simply buying an old mothballed power plant. Almost by definition, these are the dirtiest power plants in the country because they're the ones we've been able to shut down. And then you just refire that power plant, and instead of taking the power to the grid, you just put it to a bunch of computers that are mining Bitcoin or some other cryptocurrency operation. So look, we're opposed to gas-fired power plants in general. Using that power solely to power crypto operations is particularly egregious. And it's not theoretical, it's happening in New York in the Finger Lakes at this power plant called Greenwich on Seneca Lake. So I say all that to say that's kind of the problem, right? We saw that and said, okay, we have to stop this. We worked with a bunch of groups around the state and a bunch of grassroots groups around that plant in the Finger Lakes to pass a moratorium through both houses of the legislature. Really, really difficult campaign. The crypto guys poured millions of dollars in campaign contributions and into lobbying. It didn't matter. We rolled them, beat them, and passed the bill. Governor Hochul is still yet to sign it. I'm hopeful that she will, but it's going to take pressure to get her to sign it too. But just getting it to that point is really, really exciting. That's only forward-looking, though. It doesn't affect that plant on Seneca Lake that's currently burning gas to power Bitcoin mining. But what's really cool is right after the legislative session ended and we won that victory, we also won a big victory with Governor Hochul denying the air permit for that power plant. So that doesn't shut it down, but it paves the way to the eventual closure of that plant. And we think turns the tide against this really awful industry and this really awful dynamic of repowering some of the dirtiest power plants in the state. So yeah, two really big examples of local organizing working. And I think in this current political environment, and certainly given the Supreme Court ruling, all the more important that we can win, that we do win in the states where we have opportunities to do so, like New York and Pennsylvania.
Thanks, Alex. It's really inspiring to hear some of those local wins and just see the power of organizing and why it's so important that we do continue to grow that movement. So I think, could you tell us a little bit about what's next? What are some other current or upcoming opportunities that we are working towards?
Sure, yeah. So to stay in the Northeast, we're in neighboring New Jersey, neighboring each of those states, we are involved in a big campaign to stop the expansion of gas infrastructure. So there is no fracking in New Jersey, there's no shale, but obviously the state is really reliant on natural gas. And not only reliant, but we haven't even made the decision to stop building new fossil fuel projects, right? So in Jersey, the political dynamics are interesting too. Dems are in charge of both houses, huge majority. Governor Phil Murphy's a Dem, but one with a mixed track record on fossil fuels. So there are seven, probably more than this, but seven major, really big fossil fuel projects in front of the governor right now that he will either eventually kill or eventually approve. And so we've stitched together this big movement across the state of New Jersey to oppose each and every one of those. You know, the campaigns, in some ways, are seven different campaigns, but we've tried to really make it one big thing, right? And say, look, you need to reject all of this, to sort of draw a political line in the sand that approving any of these is turning your back on the climate movement and taking New Jersey in the wrong direction. And so it's unclear what will happen on those. Several of them have decision points coming this summer, so we will know more really, really quickly about what Governor Murphy does. But one really cool thing that I was lucky enough to go to a couple of weeks ago, we had a huge rally and march in Trenton that was just truly powerful. You had all seven of those fights represented and the diversity and power of the crowd in kind of all respects, right? It was a particularly racially diverse crowd, but also it was just every single part of New Jersey, right? Because every region of the state is threatened by one of these. And it was just a cool event to go to because so often those pipeline fights or fights against a power plant are really particular to the place. You know, you can feel like it's your town fighting it alone. And this was a moment where it was sort of the whole state coming together to support one another and say, look, we can't build any of this stuff Really, really powerful, huge crowd, several hundred people in like a pouring rain, not great day in Trenton. So really, really powerful and proud of the work there. I'm hopeful that we can, that we'll have good news to share in the months to come.
Awesome. Thanks, Alex. I kind of want to take things full circle and go back to talking about the courts. So, just given the extreme decisions that have been coming out of the court recently, what can we do to restore balance there?
We at Food and Water Watch are part of the coalition that is pushing to expand the court. The size of the Supreme Court is arbitrary. It's set by Congress. It has changed multiple times over the history of the country, although it hasn't for well over 100 years. When it was set at the current 9 members, there were 9 circuit courts in the US. There are currently 13. So we think it's perfectly reasonable that the Supreme Court should be expanded to 13 members so that there's 1 per circuit, as there was when the court was expanded to be 9 justices in the 19th century. So we are continuing to work with coalition partners to build a majority in both the House and the Senate that is willing to take the steps necessary to expand the court, to add those 4 justices, and to provide real balance to the court, so that we don't continue to have this extreme ideological court making these sorts of rulings, not only, of course, on environmental issues, but on all sorts of issues that touch our lives. This has been ongoing work. It's going to continue to be ongoing work, but it's vital work that we have to pursue if we want to restore balance on the court.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And Tara, just, what are some other ways we can still work in the courts outside of the position or the petition that you discussed?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, this definitely will change, I think, a lot of groups' approaches to legal advocacy in certain ways. But there are a lot of things we can still do in the courts, and the vast, vast majority of cases, thankfully, don't ever reach the Supreme Court. The courts have overall, the federal courts have moved far to the right, and that's an ongoing challenge to our work. But we can continue to challenge the legality of, for example, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission approvals of fossil fuel and pipeline projects. FERC has to consider climate change impacts and indirect impacts of its actions, and it consistently falls short. We've had success in federal circuit courts challenging these actions when they're not adequate. And sometimes these types of projects, when they're litigated, they can kind of collapse under their own weight. The delay that you can get from challenging inadequate environmental reviews can actually kill some of these horrible projects. We can also continue to challenge federal regulatory actions that, like fossil fuel leasing, for similar reasons when environmental considerations aren't adequate. And under our bedrock environmental laws, citizens and organizations can also directly sue fossil fuel polluters when they violate environmental permits and requirements. And so that's definitely something that we and our allies also consider doing, when it will help make these industries come closer to paying the harmful costs of their business as usual and make it less affordable to cling to fossil fuels. So I guess I'll just wrap that up by saying, even though the court's decision is definitely a limitation, and it's a big signal that the court will be very closely scrutinizing federal agency authority moving forward on a lot of different fronts, we can't just throw out legal advocacy from our toolbox. We have to work on every front, including in the courts, if we're going to win. And despite this, we think we can still win even in the courts. And obviously we have to win our overall campaign.
Thanks, Tara. Yeah, and it sounds like there's still so much that we can do in the courts, at the federal level, at the state and local level, to make sure that we are addressing the climate crisis. And my colleagues touched on all the primary ways that we can work together to do this just now, but we'll also put a link in the chat for you for an article that we just published earlier today about 5 ways we can keep fighting for the climate, which is just a helpful summary of everything that we've just discussed. So I do encourage you to check that out and share it, let others know how we can keep up this work. So before we wrap up today, I also want to address just one of the most repeated questions I've seen in the Q&A box today, which is essentially, what can I do? What can I do now? So I want to share two really important ways that you can help in addition to what my colleagues have just laid out. So one of the best things that you can do is to get involved with Food and Water Watch as a volunteer. As Alex and Mitch were saying, there's a lot of critical work that can be done at the local, state, and federal level that can have a really big impact. And our volunteers are key to making that happen. We have volunteers all over the country. Many of you are here today, so thank you. So I encourage you to check out this link that we'll put in the chat to our volunteer dashboard where you can sign up for upcoming opportunities. That's also where you can join our calling and texting teams. And this is a great way to volunteer since you can make calls or send texts from home when it works for your schedule. So just sign up for one of the monthly central volunteer meetings on that dashboard, and you'll learn how to get started. So the other really important way that you can help is by becoming a Food and Water Watch partner. So I would like to introduce my colleague, Madeline, who can tell you a little bit more about what it means to be a partner. Madeline, who now manages our partners program, is actually a former volunteer, and she worked closely with our organizers to lobby for fracking bans and comprehensive climate action bills where she lives in Virginia. So Madeline, will you tell us a little bit more?
Sure thing, absolutely. And thanks, Kate. And hello, everyone. It's so great to see so many people here ready to take action and mobilize in the wake of this, absolutely egregious ruling from the Supreme Court. And I have to say, listening to Alex talk about what we've achieved recently in the Northeast, really exciting, really, really inspiring, because I just think it's more evidence that our organizing strategy works, and that when we mobilize and target people with power, we see the climate action we need and are going to need to see moving forward. So to continue doing this work and to continue keeping this pressure up, we definitely need donations to make it happen. Monthly gifts are really key to winning this fight for our climate. And to break it down for you, these donations go directly to our organizing work. So we use them to continue applying consistent pressure to key decision makers. That means organizing rallies like the one in New Jersey, petition drops, action blasts, and really ensuring we're using all the tools in our toolkit to make sure that our representatives hear our message loud and clear, and also feel enough pressure that they do what is right and what we elected them to do. So if you want to make a monthly gift today, you can use the link in the chat, or you can text the word SCOTUS to 23321, and gifts of $8 a month and up make a huge contribution to this fight as we launch our response in the wake of this decision from the Supreme Court. And I did want to say to those of you who are already monthly donors, I've seen many of you in the chat here. Thank you, thank you, thank you. You're powering this movement. You're allowing us to keep up this constant pressure already. We're so grateful to have you. And thank you all again for being here today and for what you're doing. I'm so inspired and glad to have you in this fight with us. And I'll turn it back over to you, Kate.
Thanks, Madeline. And thank you, Mitch, Tara, and Alex, for being part of this conversation today. And thank you to all of those of you who joined the call. I really want to echo Madeline's thanks to all of our partners here, to all of our volunteers, to everybody who joined today. Before we close, I just want to share a couple of additional upcoming event opportunities we have. So you can join us again over the next couple of weeks. So next Wednesday, we are actually hosting another event about manatees. So at that event, we'll hear from scientists and activists to learn more about the dangers that manatees are facing from factory farms and fossil fuel power plants, and how our work in those areas goes hand in hand with protecting these creatures. So you can sign up for that to join us on July 20th. I also invite you to join us again in September for Against All Odds, which is our benefit to protect our planet. So this year it'll be a hybrid event, so you can join us virtually like you are today, or if you live in New York City, you can join us for an in-person reception in the city. So whichever option you choose, we'll hear from special guest speakers, we'll celebrate our victories, and we will mobilize for the work ahead. As Alex said, as Madeline said, when we come together and mobilize, we have the power to take meaningful steps to address the climate crisis. And Food and Water Watch will keep fighting no matter the odds. We know that we can win. And I know that you stand with us in that commitment. So thank you for joining us today. And I hope that you'll join us for Against All Odds to celebrate the progress that we've made and continue taking action alongside us for the future. If you're interested in attending, you can learn more about that event and get tickets at the link that we'll share in the chat. So with that, I want to thank you all for joining us today. We'll be sending out the recording and the links that we shared in the chat in the next day or so. So keep an eye out in your email for that. So thanks again. I hope you all have a great afternoon, and we'll see you next time.